and welcome to today's discussion. We're thankful that you guys could take out the time and join us for this fantastic discussion on Pakistan's economic growth and policy making in the country. I'm going to be moderating this discussion. My name is Uzair Younus, and I'm joined here by Faiz Ahmed, who is an MBA candidate at the Harvard Business School. And some of you may already have seen some of the stuff he keeps putting out. He's the founder of Macro Pakistani, a data-driven research platform that aims to provide a basic understanding of the country's economy. And Faiz and his team have been putting out a lot of really good data, visualized data, easy to digest data that's helping many of us understand what's going on in the country, what some of the major challenges and opportunities there are. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Faiz, who can kick things off and present to us some of the key points that he wanted to talk about. The way we're going to do this discussion is Faiz is going to do his presentation. I will ask a couple of follow-up questions to kickstart our discussion. And then those of you that are joining here on Zoom, please feel free to send in your questions and we can have a free-flowing exchange as we move along. So Faiz, over to you.
Thanks, Uzair, for moderating. And thank you, Farooq. He's not here. You're supposed to be moderating earlier for the idea behind this session as well. Generally, what he wanted to do was talk about the very basics of growth in Pakistan and the basics of policy making, which an investor, if thinking about Pakistan, should be considering before entering the country. I'll just share my screen if that's visible. And when I at least start to think about Pakistan, the first thing that I like to think about is who do you compare Pakistan to, right? Do you start comparing yourselves to the US or Singapore, which are high income countries according to the World Bank? Do you compare yourself to China? We've heard a lot of that as well. But again, it's an upper middle income country now, so maybe that's not as fair a comparison. Do you compare yourself to Afghanistan, which is a low income country? Maybe in some cases that comparison actually does make sense. But how I like to think about comparisons with Pakistan is with the cohort of lower middle income countries, right? Pakistan is at the lower end of lower middle income countries, which are defined as those with gross national income per capita, so income per capita, that is between $1,000 to roughly $4,000. So Pakistan is at the lower end of that. I really like to compare Pakistan to countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, who are smack in the middle of the cohort, and not so much Indonesia, which is again at the higher end of these countries. And the main thing over here in terms of the comparison is, yes, you are less in terms of per capita income than India and Bangladesh, who are closer to $2,000, and we're at $1,400, but you're also lower in terms of real growth. So it's two things at the same time, which is you have lower income per capita, but you also have lower real GDP growth, right? What you see on the y-axis as compared to the x-axis. And Uzair, feel free to interrupt in the middle as well in case you need to. We can keep this as candid as possible. So this growth that I say, Pakistan is around 4% and the rest of the countries are around 6-7% that you should be comparing them to. This 4% is actually not constant, right? If you start looking at Pakistan's growth trajectory, and Uzair and I have had a discussion before this where I'm showing you the last 15 years, but if you take this out to the 1970s as well, you will see this growth cyclicality in terms of 10-year growth cycles happens all the time. How this basically happens is Pakistan is a consumption-driven economy, right? Your growth is actually based on consumption, and I will explain what that means in a little while. And when you consume a lot as a country, you don't save enough, right? So you are not saving enough and investing enough. If you don't invest enough, you will not have productivity enhancement in the country, which is as your labor force grows, you will not have real output per person increasing in the country. That's basically ideally how Pakistan should have been growing, but instead how it grows is that the population increases, we have more mouths to feed, as the more mouths to feed leads to more consumption in the country, which eventually leads to GDP growth. Because we don't have productivity growth in the country, what happens is your potential output is not high enough, domestic potential output. So as domestic consumption demand goes up, and maybe I'm complicating things a little bit over here, but I will simplify it and say, basically, when Pakistan cannot produce enough goods to provide to its country citizens, it starts importing consumption. So this cycle of you start growing really fast, then you realize you cannot provide the goods and services required for your country. So you start importing consumption, you grow a bit more, and then you realize you can't print dollars to import consumption. So you need to go back to the IMF one way or another. And basically you end up with a balance of payment crisis and the whole cycle repeats itself, right? So what you will see every time is you start consuming a lot. At some point in time, you start importing a lot, you enter a balance of payment crisis, and a contraction happens. One thing to note on this chart basically is that even before COVID, your growth was supposed to go down, right? If you notice the gray line, what was happening was your 10-year cycle of growth was going to come to an end, and post 2018-19, the growth was going to start slowing down as part of your IMF program as well. COVID just made things worse. Like that's something that we should be looking at. But now, when I say Pakistan is a consumption-driven economy and it doesn't invest enough, I mean as an investment to GDP for Pakistan is quite low. Why is this investment to GDP important? Because you need to invest to improve the productivity of your people. You need to improve TFP, which is your total factor productivity, which is innovation in the country, etc. And you also need to improve your labor productivity, which is the real output per person in the country itself. So in 2005, you had, if you start looking at the numbers, you had around 20% of GDP invested. Now, 2019-20, you're closer to 15% of GDP. So your investment is actually going down across the years. At the same time, if you look at the correlation with productivity, you will see at a high investment level, your productivity sort of starts to grow. And as your investment in GDP falls, your productivity levels fall as well. The two lines, green and red lines, are showing productivity, both total factor productivity and labor productivity in the country. Yes, there are shocks as well. So the Kashmir earthquake happened in 2005, the global financial crisis happened in 08-09, and that brought down productivity to a certain extent. But if you see net, your productivity growth actually does not exceed 2 to 4% ever. Even when your foreign income goes up, so foreign savings in the country go up, which you see with the light blue over there, you don't actually have improvement in productivity in the country. And this is a bit counterintuitive to me because I've been hearing all my life, FDI, foreign direct investment in the country is great. And you should invest as much as, you should invite as many countries to invest in the country, in Pakistan as possible. But what ends up happening is if you start looking at 2006, for example, yes, you had the crisis, but that's also when foreign saving in the country started to spike up, but productivity went down and it stayed low for quite some time. And my hypothesis, and I read a few reports with the State Bank as well, is that Pakistan does not get enough efficiency-seeking investments, right? What the sort that you get in Vietnam, the sort you get in Bangladesh, the sort that you're getting in India, which is a foreign company will come into the country and try to improve the productivity, enhance the productivity of the people over there, create value-added products in the country, just so that the productivity of the people and the prosperity of the country grows. Instead, the kind of FDI that Pakistan gets, a large amount in the oil and gas sector, but another amount in the market-seeking sector of FMCGs and, for example, telcos. So Unilever is in the country not so that it can enhance the productivity of residents of the country. It's there to serve the country and sell us as many products as possible. They're there because Pakistan is a country of 220 million people, and that's a sufficiently big market to serve. That's why I think even when there is an increase in FDI, even when there's an increase in foreign saving in the country, you're not able to improve productivity in Pakistan to date. Let me put some numbers out there just so that we can understand what is this productivity stuff that I'm talking about. So if you take real output per worker, so how many, the quantity produced per worker across sectors, right? And you start breaking it down. So what I'm comparing on the x-axis is 2014, what that number was productivity in 2014 versus what it was in 2018. So a 5-year change. If you're on the red line or close to the red line, you basically have not changed in the last 5 years. If you move up, like construction has, there's been a bit of a productivity increase. If you go down, such as in utilities, you know that there has been a reduction in productivity. Overall, net, you will see a lot of sectors have not improved in terms of productivity in the country, and average labor productivity is almost unchanged as well. A key point to note here, we were talking about 4% GDP growth in the past. Your labor force is growing at 4 to 5% a year as well, which means every year you will have 4 to 5% of people added to your labor force, workforce, which means if you don't grow at least 4 to 5%, you will actually have lower productivity each consequent year, right? Just in terms of math, you need to grow at least 4 to 5% to continue having stagnant productivity in the country. This is a very important point because that basically shows you need to have at least more than 5% GDP to have any chance of having productivity growth in the country, right? And productivity growth is eventually linked to income growth, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, which comes about if you have productivity growth in the country.
And really quickly, Faiz, I think the point I want to underscore on income growth is huge, because the wage growth issue then leads to consumers and citizens being able to save more, which ties back to your earlier point about the domestic savings investment gap. I think that's a very, very important point for people to, realize.
Yeah, exactly. And so coming to this point, right? Just to put numbers out there, in terms of Pakistan and Bangladesh is one comparison that I really like, so I put it out there, but also with South Asia, which is our neighboring countries, and low middle income countries, which is the cohort we spoke about at the start. So investment to GDP, we already said, okay, it's low. And like Uzair, you just mentioned, it's low as a consequence of saving as well. So saving in Pakistan is around 12% of GDP. Bangladesh is 36%. That's 3 times the saving of Pakistan. Hence, they are able to invest more than 30% of their GDP over there as well, right? Hence, they have the productivity growth that we see and a higher GDP overall as well. All of this I put under this heading of growth basics, right? Which Pakistan, I feel, misses quite a lot. So one growth basic we've spoken about enough is investment and saving and productivity growth. All of this maybe drives into an export-driven policy where your growth is based on exports to the rest of the country. You're selling higher value-added products, like for example, Bangladesh is now with ready-made garments, and all of this comes about requires human development in the country, right? I actually don't like the metric of literacy rates that much, but for the purposes of this conversation, let's look at that. So we're at 59-60% literacy rate in Pakistan compared to 75% in Bangladesh. If you start looking at what people have started comparing now, which are learning outcomes, so educational quality rather than just quantity and literacy, which is if you can write or not, our harmonized learning outcomes are lower than Afghanistan's, right? So our educational quality is actually worse than Afghanistan's. That's the current ranking at the moment. And this productivity growth, all of this fancy stuff in terms of investment and saving that I'm speaking about does not come about till your people have more capability. Your labor force is actually good enough to be rewarded higher. And all of that will come about from education. That's what I personally believe. What is needed on top of that is also everything that people talk about, which is institutional quality. You need better institutions, better rule of law in the country. You also need ease of doing business, which is again a favorite item for people to talk about in Pakistan, because we improved by X places and now we're at 108 as of 2019. But again, for these two numbers, compare where Bangladesh is at, right? They have worse institutional quality and they have significantly worse ease of doing business in the country. How is it that they're still growing as fast as they are? How is it that they've managed to increase their productivity? How is it that they've crossed Pakistan in terms of GDP per capita and overall GDP? My personal thesis is that it's because while we were consuming back in the 1980s and 90s, they were saving and investing for the future, right? They were thinking long term. They started saving, investing, had productivity enhancing initiatives that not only captured the male side of the labor force, but also the female side of the labor force. They improved female labor force participation, also have a solid on the ground network of, let's say, devolution of power to local governments. That's something that we've also spoken about before. And that's how they've been able to grow. So I like every time people say, oh, corruption is the only issue in Pakistan, or ease of doing business is the only issue in Pakistan, I say other South Asian, other lower middle income countries, and specifically Bangladesh also have very similar developing country problems. What Pakistan should be focusing on is improving investment and improving its human development.
Faiz, may I also add just one thing to put for the audience things in perspective? And the Bangladesh example is extremely valid. So if you look at 1971, GDP per capita between Pakistan and Bangladesh, roughly Pakistan was about 45% higher than Bangladesh when Bangladesh got its independence. Today, Bangladesh's GDP per capita is about 45% higher than Pakistan. So they've reversed and flipped the entire equation on its head because of the things Faiz just mentioned.
Completely. Now let's come into policy making, right? So I'm saying we need to invest in human development, invest in infrastructure in the country, maybe, etc. But what does the government do at the same time, right? Our government spending is actually constrained because of falling revenues, which is we don't pay enough taxes, which results in fiscal deficits, which results in interest payments in the future. I'd just like to put some numbers out there, and this is from 1980s to all the way to 2020. So the last 40 years that we're talking about. The fiscal deficit results because there is not high enough government revenue to service the government expenditures that the government budgets, right? As simple as that. In the 1980s, your deficit used to vary between 7 to 8%. It still varies between 7 to 8%, but sometimes 9% 40 years down the line as well. Government revenue has actually gone down from 17% of GDP to 15% of GDP in 2020. But what's interesting is government expenditure. So you're right, you used to spend 25% of your GDP on government expenditures, and the breakup was very interesting because of the time that we were in at that point in time. Military expenditure was 7% of your GDP, right? At the same time, development expenditure was also 7% of your GDP, right? So yes, military was the focus, but development for the future was also a focus. Interest payments were obviously low because your debt load was not as high, so they varied between 3 to 4% of GDP was interest payments. Fast forward to 2020, because of all the fiscal deficits you've had in the past, your interest markup payments, which is what you pay on the interest, pay on the loans that you take to finance your deficits, has risen to over 6% of GDP, from 3 to 4% to 6% of GDP. Military expenditure from 7% has actually gone down to 3 to 4%. But what's gone down the most is your development expenditure from 7% to less than 3% of GDP today. So everything that we spoke about before in terms of you need to have more investment in the future, more human development for the future, our policy basically constrains all sorts of development spending in the country. And that's primarily a function of the kind of expenses that you already have in Pakistan, right? When you take on loans to finance your deficits, you need to pay your interest payments, need to do your loan repayment. So that's one fixed piece of expenditure that has to go away from anything that you collect. The next piece of military, you need to spend 3 to 4% of GDP over there as well to quote unquote stay competitive. I say 3 to 4% because there's actually a discrepancy in how Pakistan reports its defense spending. If you look at just defense spending, it's 3% of GDP, but the pensions that you pay the military are included in the civilian budget. So that's almost 1% of GDP as well. So you end up paying close to 4% of GDP in military expenditures, while you spend less than 3% on health and education combined. That's the main message that we need to take away from policy making in the country. Moving forward, when I say deficits need to be financed, right? And this is an investment forum, so I'll focus more on the investment side of things. This is a snapshot of what domestic lending in the country has been like for the last 30 odd years. As you see, the red line shows total lending in the country by commercial banks, which has been growing, which is generally a good thing. So your debt market is developing, let's call it that. The black line, on the other hand, shows what the private sector credit to GDP is at the same time. So while your overall lending is going up, you will notice private sector lending is actually going down, which means the increase in total lending is coming about because of public sector borrowing. What this means is because the public sector is borrowing, the private sector is unable to borrow, which is the definition of crowding out in economics when people start, for those interested. This has two big problems. Let me talk about the first problem. So the crowding out, specific comparison to Vietnam is interesting, which is why I highlighted that. In the 1990s, your private sector to GDP for Pakistan was actually higher than Vietnam's, right? They were both pretty low, but higher than that. Today, given Vietnam's growth, both in terms of exports, imports, all of its productivity enhancing initiatives, it has had to take financing for long-term fixed investments, and it has grown as a result. Pakistan, on the other hand, has actually decreased its private sector credit to GDP from somewhere around 30% to 17%. And this basically shows you the difference in growth in the two countries as well. If you look at Bangladesh and India as well, they're closer to 50% private credit to GDP. And okay, maybe we should explain this private sector to GDP a bit as well, because maybe it's not as clear. As we spoke about, you have limited savings in the country, so you are not able to invest. One way to supplement that saving would be to take on loans and invest for the future. Pakistan does not provide enough private sector credit, not just to the big firms, but also the small firms in the country. Hence, it is not able to invest for the long term. The private credits that you see over here as well, 67% of this in terms of flows is actually working capital. When there is inflation in the country, when you just need money to run the business, that 67% of the credit that's given out in Pakistan, 15% is roughly the long-term fixed investment that a business should be doing. The typical developing country average is around 40%. So a big difference between how much Pakistan is investing for the future in terms of savings as well as the credit that it's getting.
And just really quickly, this slide in particular, Faiz, I think what stood out to me based on the long-term trends you've shown is that not only is the state crowding out the private sector and your private sector credit is not growing, but it's not like the state itself is borrowing more money to invest in development spending. It is borrowing more money for all sorts of other things. So it's a double whammy, right? You have scarce savings. The government is tapping into them more and more, not to fund investment. And at the same time, it's crowding out the private sector. So both ways you come out the loser because investment just doesn't go up and you're burning cash for things that are not productive in nature.
Yeah, and burning cash is a nice point because you're burning cash after printing cash. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about is this deficit financing is actually inflationary, right? So maybe before this whole state bank autonomy stuff started happening, what happened before is the government could borrow from two places. It could either go to the commercial banks to borrow, which is what we discussed, but it could also go to the state bank to borrow. What is the difference between borrowing from the state bank versus borrowing from commercial banks? With the state bank, even if your interest rates are high, you don't mind paying that because the state bank profit with their income actually ends up back into your pocket as non-tax revenue. So think of state bank borrowing as essentially no interest-free loans that the government can just go and pick up at any point in time. The government has a deficit, it goes to the state bank, says we need a loan. Okay, whatever the interest rate is, state bank prints cash, gives the money to the government, and that just leads to inflation, right? So what I can show you in the next slide is actually just in terms of what the split is between state bank and commercial banks borrowing. But here it's important to see what happened in the last few years, right? You will see the average policy rate, the interest rate, lending rate that you had in the country. We know it started spiking up from 2017-18 all the way to 2020, where it was 13.25% or something like that. At the same time, you see commercial bank borrowing, which is scheduled banks, actually go down, the gray line, and the green line of state bank actually going up, right? So you see This is basically what was happening in the country, which led to all sorts of inflationary pressures later on. But the main thing about this is that monetary policy, which is how the state bank affects interest rates to affect inflation in the consequently, is left ineffective when this happens. Because no matter how, first thing we decided is that the government is the largest creditor in the country, right? It takes on more loans than the private sector. So when you increase interest rates, it's actually not for the private sector like it is in the rest of the world. It is more for the public sector to control their spending. But you see over here that the public sector actually didn't care about interest rates because it just used to go to the state bank instead and borrow as much as possible. When the state bank gives out money, it prints money and adds to money supply in the country, right? When people have more money, they spend more. And when they spend more, the prices of that basket of goods goes up. It's actually as simple as that, which is how I like to call it is demand pull inflation. And we'll have a few questions, I'm assuming, about demand pull versus cost push inflation. So I'll park those for now and discuss them in a little while. I'll just give you a few stats on this before we proceed. So the budgetary borrowing on cash basis that I just mentioned. In the green, you see state bank share. In the gray, you see the scheduled banks that I was talking about. As soon as you see state bank share rising up with a lagged effect, you will see inflation climb, right? And that's evidence of state bank borrowing being inflationary in the country. At the same time, you have an exchange rate policy, which is also very politically managed, right? So what I took is from 2001 onwards, this is monthly exchange rates that you'll see, and I averaged them out. During the Musharraf era, we know it was the 60, like this is when I was growing up, $60 to 60 rupees to a dollar was the exchange rate. During the PPP, it actually moved a bit, but on average, it was 89. But June 2013 onwards, you see the straight line where it varied between 100 and 105. And during the PTI's time, we're seeing it grow all the way up to 160, right? What does this exchange rate management do when you keep your exchange rate fixed? That's what's important for everyone to understand. In Pakistani terms, how they thought about it is we want exchange rate stability no matter what, right? We want people to come in and invest in the country, which is a good cause to have. I'm not saying it's completely unreasonable to want that, but at the cost of your exports becoming uncompetitive, that should not be fine. So what you see in terms of the two lines that you're seeing, let me explain the difference between the two. There's the red line, which is real effective exchange rate, which is what matters when you're trading between countries. And the nominal exchange rate is in green, which actually does not matter that much when you're trading between countries, because what people want to see when they're trading with you is it beneficial for me to trade with you, or is it beneficial for me to trade with Bangladesh? I'm just taking on an example. It is in real effective terms, adjusted for inflation, adjusted for your price level, adjusted for your competitiveness. Does it make sense for me to trade with you or not? It is an index, which means it started off at 100 around 2010, and it basically tracks just changes across that 100 now. And if you see beyond that, starting from 2010, you'll see this number is rising. The red line is rising, but at the same time, the green line is also rising. In actuality, these two lines should be going separately, because the real exchange rate going from 100 to 110 is actually appreciation, which is an improvement in its value. While in a nominal exchange rate, as we know, if a dollar goes from 150 to 160, it's actually depreciating, it's losing value. It's just how it is denominated, but the two moving cohesion should already tell you that there was a problem in our exchange rate regime during the past few years. What was actually happening was we tried to manage our exchange rate, keep it fixed, but we had inflation in the country. So when you have inflation in the country, the prices of your goods are going up, but you're trying to artificially maintain their value at a fixed exchange dollar rate, which just doesn't work in terms when there's a competitive environment out there. So what you will see is your exports start stagnating, at 31, 32 actually billion at some point as well, stagnated or fell all the way down to 28 billion. But because your imports were so cheap, because you were keeping your exchange rate artificially low, your imports started to increase all the way from 48 billion to 67 billion in 2017, right? If you take this slide and compare it to the growth cycles that I spoke about early on, and I said there comes a point in time where Pakistan starts importing consumption, this was that point in time, right? Because you are a consumption-driven economy and because your growth is dependent on consumption, you wanted, or the previous government at least, wanted to keep that exchange rate artificially low so that imports were cheap and they could show the growth that they eventually ended up sustaining. But this in the long term is not sustainable at all. And I'm sure you have a few questions, so I'll pause there and open it up.
So thanks, Faiz, for that really good discussion. I'm going to play devil's advocate for a couple of points that you mentioned. So we have a more robust exchange of ideas here. You kept saying imported consumption, import consumption. Now, when I look at the import makeup of the imports all the way from 2013 to 2018, a significant share of that were machinery imports. I think if I recall at its peak, it was about 40 something odd percent that were coming in. And then the next big cycle basket is fuel. And every economy needs fuel. Pakistan is an importer of energy, so it needs more fuel more than the others. So wouldn't one then argue that, hey, we're keeping the overvalued exchange rate to not finance consumption, but actually buy imported machinery at a lower real cost? And that actually is good for the country because, hey, if we don't import machinery and invest in our industrial ecosystem, it's not going to grow. How would you respond to that?
No, I would say definitely, and you're completely right. So machinery imports went up, oil, because we need that, also went up. But at the same time, food commodities was also going up in terms of imports. So when I say imported consumption, I'm talking more about the consumption side of this. Machinery imports eventually end up as investments in the country. So that's very good. Oil becomes a raw, let's say, raw material into other products as well, which I'm completely fine with. What I basically mean by that is you need to import what you can sustain as well, right? But your exports were not growing at the same time. So while you were investing technically for the future, I know there was a lot of machinery import for textile as well. People were setting up plants, but where did that growth end up happening? I didn't see that growth in textiles. I didn't see that growth in other industries coming about as well. What you saw instead was people taking advantage of all sorts of subsidies that were provided, all sorts of tax breaks that you were given. And I know there's a very famous UNDP report that's out that everyone started reading. But if you break that down, you will see a large chunk of it went to the exporters, a large chunk of it went to the the high net worth individuals. And this is not conspiracy talking. Like I'm willing to give you numbers behind that as well. I don't think the imports that were done between 2013 and 18 were sustainable. If your exports were going up at the same time, at a similar level, that would be something you could expect to continue in the future. But I don't think it was sustainable at all.
Thanks for that. And I would also just add that, you can sustain an overvalued currency for a short period of time. In the long term is simply impossible. Undervalued is possible, as we've seen from the Chinese example. But at the end of the day, even if you're maintaining an overvalued exchange rate, at the end of the day, you have to outrun that overvaluation through productivity growth. And if you don't do that, then you have a problem on your hands, as we've seen in the Pakistani case. I think the other thing, and I want to get your take on this as well, is from an overall positioning perspective, right? We had these investments come into, let's say, the energy sector in Pakistan in these past few years. How much of an added burden has the lack of reform in some of these sectors added to the mismatch in the fiscal deficit side? So I'm thinking about, for example, Pakistan was able to bridge its energy deficits, but the circular debt also blew up. Do you think that that's also somehow played a role in terms of creating this crowding out effect where the private sector is just not being able to invest in the economy, or is it a much larger phenomenon?
I'm glad you said the last part. I think it is a much larger phenomena. So yes, it was able to close the electricity in general was an issue in the past, and now you have surplus generation, right? The interesting thing about circular debt is that it is, for those who understand, off balance sheet. It is actually not on the balance sheet of the government, and this was done in the PML time as well, where there is a separate public holding company that holds circular debt. It is not on the balance sheet of the government. So when I talk about fiscal deficits, when I talk about them not being able to meet their obligations, as of now, this obligation is not their obligation. So it's sitting off their balance sheet. So when this is also a ticking time bomb, that when now that you have excess electricity, you are paying higher end capacity charges. Those capacity charges being when you're not consuming electricity, you still need to pay for it because you had agreements in the past with those producers. As these charges are increasing, you are adding to a debt load of circular debt, which you are saying you're not responsible for. I know there have been some resolutions that have come recently. I think there's a 400 billion subsidy that's going to be paid in June or something along those lines, but the number is 2.2, 2.3 trillion off balance sheet debt, which we don't discuss enough. But that's basically my answer to it's a much larger phenomena than what we see in our daily lives because it's off balance sheet.
And I think that off balance sheet, we get a sneak peek of that, I would say, into what's going on, because as you mentioned earlier, that some 60-something% of the borrowing that occurs on the private sector side is working capital. So private sector is also the IPPs who don't get paid in time and then borrow from the market, but that's a whole other debate. Altaf has a question which sort of ties into what I was going to ask next as well. He's asking about elite capture and the role of elite capture in terms of, the lack of incentives to develop your human capital, to build productivity, etc. My question is very similar as well. Like, I sometimes I'm aghast, for example, when I look at the Pakistan Business Council reports, and sometimes they argue that, oh, look, the companies in Pakistan do actually really well. They have X times the profits of their comparative counterparts in India, globally, etc. And I argue that excess profits is actually a sign of monopolization and cartelization. That also ties into elite capture. So how much of that role, both structurally on the economic side, does elite capture play in terms of disincentives for human capital development, and also as a disincentive to innovation, productivity growth, competition in the marketplace? And what's your take on how do we even begin solving this mess?
I think there needs to be a balance. So balance between what you're saying, let's call it rent-seeking profit maximization on one side and human capital development on another side. The elite capture and everything that we speak about over there, I actually think maybe we need to dig into the numbers that they've reported a bit more, because some of the things that they're talking about are in terms of subsidies and tax breaks that they get. I think some of them are actually warranted and some of them are actually help development in the country. In terms of human capital development, these countries, so profits are not necessarily a bad thing. Let's start with that. Like making, I know in terms of economics, you will say if you were making above average profit, it's a monopoly or oligopoly, etc. I don't think we should think about profit maximization as a bit of an issue right now. Let's think about what you can do in terms of improving productivity per capita per sector. So let's take manufacturing, for example. How can you take the textile industry and improve the value added product created by that industry in every possible stage, right? So move from exporting yarn to exporting, for example, ready-made garments or something like athleisure, which is becoming quite popular in the Western world. So start exporting that, change your product mix, think about how you can get the most out of your labor force, how you can create the highest value, highest skill, highest paying jobs, rather than think about, okay, is the cement industry making outside profits or not?
But let me push back on this then. Yeah. I'll give you a very specific example of which I know a bit over the last few days, right? So what is the incentive for a business, a firm that is able to use its cartel power or its monopolistic power and maximize its profit to invest in productivity enhancing tools when it doesn't face competition. For example, I just learned recently in some parts of Pakistan where kinnu exports are big, there are 5 or 6 kinnu exporters who are given export licenses. They don't do any value addition. They don't do anything like that. They just act as middlemen between the farmer and export it out and make a nice profit because of the 6 licenses that are there in the market. Now, in a market like that, let's say I'm that kinnu producer. I have zero incentive to invest in my production and manufacturing to make more than what I would otherwise, because my life is comfortable. I can buy a DHA plot and a Beria plot and do whatever I want with my life and send my kids abroad. So without breaking the power of these cartels that are making maximal profits, how do you invest in productivity?
Yeah. Great point. Let me counter with thinking about what do large firms contribute to Pakistan, right? The same report that was talking about elite capture was also showing you what the top 1% pay in terms of tax, what they make up in terms, I don't remember the exact breakups, but you will see that their contribution to tax revenue is also pretty high. Their contribution to job growth is also pretty high. I'm not trying to be a capitalist over here and say that you shouldn't have that. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that large firms.
We're all capitalists here. If there are no capitalists on this Park Launch investment call and economy call, then we have a problem.
No, so I'm in a bit of a fix in terms of, I want to say like super capitalist ideas in terms of, no, it is okay if a company is making outsized profits, they're definitely doing something right. But I understand that there is a huge elite capture sort of picture in Pakistan, almost like the license Raj of India in the 90s, right? It's almost like that. And I agree. But I'm saying, is it as bad as, like, again, I don't like to focus on these things as much, because I think overall aggregate, if you start improving your saving, improving your capital markets, improving your investment, you're all, a rising tide lifts all boats. And I start to think of that as an important thing. So rather than think about, okay, kinnu exporter, like, what's the incentive for anyone else to enter that market? Why is there cartelization in the cement market? I'd rather focus on how much are these big firms contributing to the country. There's a very good McKinsey report on India, if you start reading it, and it talks about the role of, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but they talk about how increasing the penetration of large players in the country actually benefits your small, medium enterprises as well, because it's an entire value chain, right? If you have someone in the textile industry making loads of money, there is everyone in the middle who is processing, from the ginners to the weavers and the spinners, all the way to the people who finish the product. It does lift all boats. So I actually don't mind large firms growing and making profit as much as they are in Pakistan. Again, what I worry about is the flip side, which is those earnings are not rewarded by the stock market, right? Let's start thinking about that. Our price to earnings ratio in the stock market is like 6 to 8 compared to emerging market average of 12 to 14. So you are like valued, your profits, the ones that you make, are valued half as much as they are in other emerging markets. I think that is something that we need to start working on, start rewarding the people who are doing well by deepening capital markets, so that we encourage further innovation to come into the country, rather than worry too much about elite capture. Maybe we can have another conversation about elite capture, because I have a lot of views on the UNDP report.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a longer discussion, but let's pivot to some issues around investing in the country and sort of what does all of this data show? So first, like Ali Faiz Ahmed has a question, like he thinks the extrapolation of these trends doesn't show a good picture. What's the end game? I would love your take on it, and I have a follow-up question to that. But first, let's hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah. So ease of doing business. I know we keep talking about ease of doing business improving in the country. The trends right now do not look good. The improvement that you saw, the ranking rising to 108, was the biggest increase in the improvement came from getting electricity in the country. This getting electricity within the ranking was not that you are actually getting electricity at home. It meant getting electricity, the application for an electricity connection through was streamlined. Like that's the process that they were talking about, and that improved your ease of doing business. So completely agreed with Ali. The trends are not looking good, but what is looking good, right? I have a preference for the state bank because I did a bit of work over there. The state bank is looking fantastic, right? It's looking fantastic in terms of digitization. So there you see public sector investment encouraging private sector investment, right? Public sector co-opting private sector investment through RAST, for example. What will RAST end up doing in the digital infrastructure of Pakistan? It will just lay the rails, right? And it's a bit of money that the state bank and the government had to spend. Yes, they will lay out the rails, but on top of that, it will be an API-based system where the private sector will have to invest and improve digitization in the country. After creating the roads, the state bank is more or less done because they're saying we our job here is done, and the private sector will have to start taking playing more of a role in improving digitization in the country. So there, I think, in terms of regulation, state bank is quite switched on. In terms of foreign exchange regulations that they've just changed, FIRA manual, I've had conversations with the people over there, impossible to change, and they've managed to change stuff over there. So you can expect all of this startup activity that's happening in terms of ESOPs, in terms of being able to repatriate money. All of these improvements, I think, are solid. SECP as well, everything that they've been doing. I actually registered Macro Pakistani completely online, sitting here in Boston with no issues. So I'm testimony to the fact that all of the SECP stuff, digitization that they're talking about is great. They're also thinking about the right kind of stuff, right? So a collateral registry that they launched last year helps in SME financing. This credit bureau that they're trying to improve, the guarantee program that they're trying to improve, PMRC, which is the Pakistan Mortgage Refinance Company, if it comes about properly. All of these are structural changes that need to come about to improve investment in the country. And let me explain why. We spoke about private sector financing. SME financing is even lower, right? It's roughly 6 to 7% of private sector lending in the country, which means it's minuscule. And you need the entire value chain to have money, right? If SMEs have money, they contribute whatever 40% to your GDP, they can grow fast. And again, like I said, the rising tide, I'm hoping will lift all boats. The big issue that these SMEs have when they go to get financing is first, banks ask for personal guarantees or they ask for collateral, which is higher than the loan amount. And most SMEs aren't willing to give that. With this registry, what they will be able to do is a lot of fancy things that we don't have to get into. But overall, I see them, SECP and state banks, stepping back, thinking about what is it, while there is, let's call it almost a government screw up happening at the same time, what can the regulators do in their own space to really make a change? And I think they're picking on the right topics to pick on to bring about some positive change in terms of investment. I think you're on mute.
Sorry. The point around SMEs is very valid. And like the typical the example I give people is like, imagine there are 500,000 SMEs in Pakistan. There are many, many more. Let's just say there are 500,000 that you can target and enable them through access to financing, through improving the regulatory burden, et cetera, to just hire one person a year, one additional person a year. That's 500,000 new jobs every single year. And the impact is across the length and breadth of the country if you do that. And that has a second and third order effect. So I think the SME point is really, really valid. I also think I agree with you that fixing those nuts and bolts and actually the excess profits that are there in the country is actually fantastic for diaspora investors who are looking to disrupt industries, who are looking to invest in startups, because excess profits are gold. That's gold that you can go after. If the policy environment shifts aggressively enough at the same time, it means that more nimble, younger, hungrier entrepreneurs will take advantage of what's out there and leapfrog ahead. So I think that's a silver lining in all of this. It's not all doom and gloom. We have a question here from Harun Saab, who's asked, what's your take on the impact of money laundering and corruption on the economy? I know you hinted at it at the beginning, but money laundering and corruption are usually interlinked in emerging and developing markets. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, so money laundering specifically and terror financing, let's put the two together. So AML, which is anti-money laundering and terror financing, is something that we've been trying to focus on for the longest time, right? We were put on the gray list in FATF, and that affects everything else that we're trying to do as a country, right? It affects your ease of doing business in terms of getting credit, in terms of your ratings globally as well. That's the extent I think anti-money laundering really affects us. If you actually check your balance, so there's an interesting thing in the balance of payments, which is errors and omissions. I don't know if people remember from back in school, if they studied economics, that's supposed to show you how much money is being smuggled in briefcases in and out of the country. In Pakistan, that amount is actually not huge, right? Yes, there is cash sitting inside the country under mattresses, but it's actually not flowing in and out as much in terms of cash.
As plot files.
Or as plot files, yes. So in terms of I think it's a bit political as well, right? That you have who's on the FATF committee and who is deciding, if you were going to remain there or not. Like banks in Pakistan now have been forced into being so prudent. The regulation is so strong. The follow-up is that the regulators do is so strong. I know that there are, I don't remember the exact out of 27, how many action items they're done with and how many are left over. But I think they've made a lot of progress in terms of improving over there. I don't think it should be the one thing that holds Pakistan back from growing in the future. But yes, it needs to sort out. It's, again, one of the nuts and bolts Pakistan needs to sort out to be able to sort out its growth basics. Like I said, institutional quality and ease of doing business. Improve that so that they can be on the path of growth in the future.
And I think the bigger issue here is the AML push is a double-edged sword, which means that it raises compliance costs for banks, which means they can't go after new customers, which has an impact on financial inclusion, translates into savings and into capital markets, blah, blah. There's a whole network effect around that.
But banks in Pakistan are sitting on so much cash that as much as it is a double-edged sword,
it is. But the other incentive, the disincentive for them also, we've talked about this. We don't have to spend a lot more time over this, but it's the fact that because the public sector is such a large borrower and pays them such nice interest rates because of the overall inflationary environment, they have no incentive to go after new markets, right? There's no. They're fat cats. They're enjoying their life as doing what the business that they do, which is traditional. The other question, and I would love your thoughts on this, is there has been a shift in the narrative coming out of Pakistan, Islamabad and Rawalpindi in particular, which is that we are looking away from geopolitics towards geoeconomics, and there's a whole range of things that they want to do as part of that pivot. How do you see this development? And do you actually see this more than a narrative, or is this just talking point so far where a lot of action needs to be followed?
Yeah, I think a lot more needs. So the switch is great if it's actually implemented. You saw words and you saw a bit of backtracking right after the famous U-turns. But let's say it actually happens and you start focusing on geoeconomics in the region. What will happen when a foreign investor comes to the country, right? In the ease of doing business, you have one component, which is about what is the rule of law, how fast you can get your money back. So if you start looking at the numbers over there, it takes over 1,000 days to resolve a court case in Pakistan, right? So if a foreign investor is coming in and says, okay, the average for OECD countries is like thrice as less as what it is in Pakistan, it's a bit risky. Why should I come into the country? If I actually invest $1 and I go to court and have an issue regarding it, I'm going to, after those 1,000 days, after that delayed justice, I'm going to end up getting 40 cents on the dollar as recovery, right? Those are the things that when you open up geoeconomics and you get someone, for example, India to start coming and investing in the country, yes, they will say, yeah, we have a sorry state of affairs in terms of regulation and law, rule of law in our own country, but it's actually worse in Pakistan. So why should I start investing in Pakistan? Think of it from the United States as well. Yes, there money flows into in Pakistan regardless of these issues, but it flows in because you guarantee returns, right? You mentioned circular debt, you mentioned electricity issues being sorted. How did we solve those issues? We solved them by guaranteeing dollar-denominated returns with quite high IRRs, which were justified IRRs. Again, I'm not going to say too much rent seeking, etc. There is math that you do behind that, and that math works out to get 15, 16% IRR in Pakistan. Made perfect sense. But that's the way you attract countries to invest in Pakistan, right? Just changing the narrative without changing the nuts and bolts isn't going to make much of a difference. So I think both things need to be worked on. Yes, Pakistan needs a better image in the international market. This forum itself, Pak Launch, is doing a fantastic job in terms of portraying that image. I think in general, it needs to also work on the nuts and bolts a bit more to be able to properly propagate the right image.
Yeah, I think like I follow India in my full-time job, and they've been masterful in the last few years in terms of doing this. Was even just last year in the middle of a pandemic, the statement was we want to build a self-reliant India. Okay, great narrative. We want to build MSMEs, etc. But very quickly that narrative and talking point was followed by $26.5 billion in priority sectors as production-linked incentives to get the manufacturing ball rolling, right? And so that's what we mean when you just don't have to talk, you have to walk the walk and capture, as I say it, capture the imagination of the international business press so that the Economist, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, et cetera, write about the reforms that you're doing, the actions you're taking. And I think we're missing some of that so far. Arif Rahman has a question. What probability do you assign to Pakistan government defaulting on its domestic debt, given that it's become so unsustainable?
So like domestic, so do you mean just domestic debt or external, like
domestic debt, but let's say both, like let's take each separately.
Yeah, I don't think you can technically default on your domestic debt, but in terms of external debt, for this year, 2021, at least you could not really default. You just had to pay the interest payments, which you've been quite successful at making. In the future, I don't think it will be like Pakistan will ever default. At least external debt, I don't think it will happen. If you start looking at the IMF report as well, even without the IMF money that's coming in, you are able to meet your debt service requirements. So you are quite safe in terms of meeting your debt service. Pakistan has not really defaulted in the past. In '98, it froze accounts, but it does, like, it's as a sovereign nation, it's not like Argentina or it's not like Ukraine, where we've defaulted heavily in the past. I don't think that's a concern that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, and I think given global interest rates where they are, there's going to be a reach for yield. So there will always be buyers for Pakistani euro in terms of what's going on. Last question before I let you go. This has been a fantastic discussion. I hope the audience has enjoyed it as much as I have. But we started with exchange rate, so I'll end with this question that one of the audience members asked, like, what's your prediction for the Pakistani rupee moving forward? I think the exact question was, do you see it going to 300 by 2025? So we'll hold your feet to the fire with this prediction.
So I try not to get into predictions, but it was interesting. A friend of mine asked me 2 months ago, when is it going to go to, a month ago, when is it going to go to 152? And I turned out to be right about that, just because of like external flows. I was said instead of 4 weeks, it'll be 3 weeks, and it was actually 3 weeks. I don't think I'll get lucky another time. Let me respond diplomatically to that answer, which is, I think your state bank has got it right for now, right? In terms of external flows, you are quite well balanced. Maybe your exports aren't rising as much as they should, but your remittances are surprising everyone. So think about, why would the currency depreciate? The currency would depreciate if your current account deficit skyrockets and you have a balance of payment issue. That's when you will be borrowing from the rest of the world and hence have a lack of dollars in the country, right? That's basically when an exchange rate would depreciate. I think, given what I see in the market in terms of remittance growth, in terms of import growth coming about, but not as fast as it should, export growth being moderate as well, I don't think you will depreciate to 300 by 2025. I'm assuming this conversation is recorded. We should connect again in 4 years and see if that happens.
Reminder on my phone. And I mean, also, I'll just add here that I think you're right. And the state bank has got it right so far as well. In the long term, the exchange rate is determined by inflation mismatches between economies. And long term, over decades, if you look at the Pakistani rupee, on average, it depreciates by about 5.5–6%, if I remember my figures correctly. So I think that's the trend, barring any major changes, oil shocks, etc. that the state bank, if it's committed to market determined exchange rates, will slowly let the market find its way. So I think that's where things will go. But yeah, there are no near-term risks for taking it to 300 rupees by 2025. So I think the long-term math works out given where Pakistan is, and that will stay pretty much the same. So Faiz, thank you so much for taking out the time today. This was a wonderful discussion and presentation. So there was one question that said, where do you get all of this data from? There's a lot of sources. I was reading in the footnotes that the sources you had in the presentation, Bureau of Statistics, World Bank, etc. But to the listeners, what I will say is, forget about that. Just follow Macro Pakistani, follow Faiz. He keeps putting out these wonderful visuals with all of the data, and that way you don't have to digest it. Faiz and his team are doing the hard work, and you just digest it. So keep up the great work, Faiz.
Thank you, Uzair. And thank you everyone for listening. Allah Hafiz.